The last word ever written in the old monastery fell from Erasmus's trembling fingers like a stone into still water, and in the silence that followed, the world forgot how to speak. It happened on a Tuesday, though by then, nobody was counting Tuesdays anymore. The act itself was unremarkable. A single sentence inscribed in faded sepia ink upon a page already yellowed beyond memory. The sentence read, "Here ends the account of all things." And the moment those final words found their place on parchment, the gift simply ceased. Somewhere in the universe, in that space between thought and breath, the ability to translate human meaning into written form evaporated like morning dew. Erasmus didn't realize what he'd done. He sat at his desk in the Scriptorium, the medieval chamber where generations of monks had bent their backs over vellum and gold leaf, and he waited for his hands to move again. They didn't. The quill lay across his fingers like a broken bone, inert and purposeless. Outside, bells that had rung for centuries fell silent, not all at once, but gradually, as though the very mechanism of sound was learning to withdraw from the world. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The monastery had been dying for decades, though no one admitted it. The brothers arrived fewer each year, and those who remained grew older, their eyes dimmer, their hands less steady. Erasmus had come there as a child of 7, brought by a father who said, "There is no future for you in the world below. But here, you might transcribe eternity." He was 53 now, his back curved like a crescent moon, his eyes magnified behind spectacles, held together with prayer and twine. He had been copying the same theological treatise for 4 years. Not the entire treatise, that would have taken a lifetime, but his portion of it. This was the ancient way of the Scriptorium. Each monk would take a section, work his way through it with meditative care, and pass it forward. The whole work would eventually come together, a collective tapestry woven by many hands across many years. Whether anyone would ever read, it seemed almost irrelevant. The act of copying was itself the prayer. Erasmus had always loved this philosophy. Writing was a form of devotion. Copying perfect, faithful copying was a way of honoring the ideas that had come before, of ensuring they didn't scatter into nothingness like sparks from a dying fire. His purpose was clear, even if the monastery walls had grown cold and the cloister now echoed with emptiness. The abbot was the only authority left. Brother Theodorus was 91 and transparent as tissue paper, sustained only by a fierce certainty that God still had work for them. He moved through the monastery corridors like a spirit, appearing suddenly beside Erasmus's desk and disappearing just as quickly, leaving only the faint smell of incense and something deeper, something like regret. The morning of the silence, Theodorus came to the Scriptorium earlier than usual. The sun hadn't quite risen. He was holding something in his skeletal hands, a manuscript, old and precious, bound in leather that had turned the color of dried blood. "I have a task for you," the abbot said, and his voice carried the weight of years compressed into a single sentence. "Our work is nearly complete." Erasmus looked up from his desk. He was in the middle of copying a passage about the nature of the soul. His pen hovered above the parchment, mid-word. "What do you mean, nearly complete?" Erasmus asked. "We have centuries of work ahead of us. We have not even—" "I know what we have not done." The abbot's interruption was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I have held this manuscript for 30 years, waiting for a sign. I believe that sign has come. It is time to write the final account." He placed the manuscript on Erasmus's desk. It was immensely old, older than the monastery itself. The pages inside were mostly blank, Erasmus saw as he opened it carefully. There was only one sentence written there, in a script so ancient that it barely resembled anything human. Let him who understands take up the pen and write what comes after. This is a hoax, Erasmus said, though he didn't believe it. Something in his chest was pulling at him, a current too strong to resist. Perhaps, the abbot smiled. Or perhaps it is the only true thing we have ever held. Write the ending, Erasmus. Tell the story of all that has been. Tell it so completely, so perfectly, that nothing more need ever be said. Write until there is nothing left to write. Erasmus didn't understand, but he began anyway. He filled his fountain pen, sharpened his quills, and started. The manuscript seemed to expand under his hand pages multiplying, surfaces appearing where there had been none before. He wrote about the monastery's founding, about the first monks who had arrived with nothing but faith and the dream of preserving knowledge. He wrote about the scribes who had come before him, each one a thread in the great tapestry. Days passed, or was it weeks? Time became strange in the Scriptorium. The bells still rang. Erasmus would hear them occasionally from far away, but he didn't mark their passing. He simply wrote, his hand moving across parchment in a state of perfect absorption. The words came from somewhere deeper than his mind, from a place he'd never known existed. Stories he had never learned poured through his pen. Histories he'd never heard whispered themselves into being. He wrote the secret names of saints, the recipes for medieval inks, the prayers spoken by monks in empty chapels at midnight. He wrote about grief and longing, and the strange beauty that lives in repetitive work. He wrote about love, not romantic love, but the deeper thing, the love that comes from commitment, from showing up day after day to a task that may never be completed. The manuscript grew fat and extraordinary. Its pages took on a luminescence that couldn't be explained by any natural light. When Erasmus wrote about winter, frost seemed to form at the margins of the parchment. When he wrote about spring, he swore he could smell new grass. Brother Theodorus would check on him occasionally, bringing bread and water that Erasmus barely ate. The abbot never spoke, but he would read over Erasmus's shoulder for a time, nodding at sentences, and then fade away like a ghost at dawn. How much longer? Erasmus asked during one of these visits, though he wasn't sure if he was asking the abbot or himself. You will know when you have written everything that needs writing, the old man replied, and so Erasmus wrote. He wrote until his fingers blistered, then passed the blistering into a state where pain became simply another texture of existence. He wrote about the invention of the alphabet, about the first humans who looked at the world and tried to trap its meaning in symbols. He wrote about paper, about how it was invented not once, but many times, in different cultures, different civilizations, each one arriving independently at the same miraculous solution. He wrote about the monks who lived before the printing press, knowing that their meticulous work would be rendered obsolete within a century, yet continuing anyway, because the work itself was the point. He wrote about libraries that burned, knowledge that evaporated, the terrible fragility of human memory. He wrote poetry in the margins. He composed prayers that had never been spoken aloud. He wrote lists of flowers, of birds, of lost languages. He wrote recipes for foods that no longer existed. He wrote letters to people long dead, messages that would never be received. The other monks began to notice something was happening. Though there were very few of them left, perhaps only 5 or 6, they started to gather outside the Scriptorium in the evenings, attracted by something they couldn't name. They would stand in the doorway and watch Erasmus write, and in their faces was a mixture of wonder and sorrow that told him everything. They understood. This was the last thing. This was the final song before the silence. Brother Theodorus grew visibly weaker. Erasmus would see him less frequently, and when he did appear, he was having to lean more heavily on the walls for support. One evening it was growing dark, and Erasmus had lit candles around his desk. Transforming the Scriptorium into something that looked like a chapel, the abbot approached with even more difficulty than usual. "I am going to die soon," he said simply. "The burden I have carried is about to pass from this world, Erasmus set down his pen. His hands were shaking. He realized he hadn't stopped writing in what might have been weeks. What burden? He asked, though he already knew. The knowledge that everything must end. The understanding that stories, no matter how perfectly preserved, must eventually reach their conclusion. I have waited my entire life to pass this knowledge to someone. I believe you are the one. I don't want it, Erasmus said. I know, the abbot replied, and there was compassion in his ancient eyes. But it is yours nonetheless. Continue your work, brother. Write until you have nothing left to write. That is all I ask. 3 nights later, Brother Theodorus died in his sleep. Erasmus heard about it from one of the younger monks who came to the Scriptorium at dawn with tears streaming down his face. The abbot was gone. The bell tolled slowly, sorrowfully 101 times, once for each year Theodorus had lived. The funeral was sparse. The remaining monks gathered in the chapel, and they sang the requiem with voices that echoed off stone. Erasmus sat in the back, unable to join them, unable to pray. The weight that the abbot had carried now rested entirely on his shoulders. He felt it pressing down, immense and suffocating. When the service ended, Erasmus returned to the Scriptorium and picked up his pen once more. The manuscript was now so thick that it was difficult to hold. The pages seemed to multiply no matter how many he filled, but something was changing. The words were coming slower now. The flow that had carried him for so long was becoming more difficult. Erasmus found himself having to think through each sentence to make sure it was exactly right, because now every word seemed to matter in a way it hadn't before. He was approaching something. He could feel it. A terminus. An ending. He wrote about the invention of the printing press and what it meant when texts could be reproduced infinitely. He wrote about how this liberation, the spread of knowledge, came with a strange cost. The death of the monk as cultural carrier. The death of the Scriptorium. The end of an era where the act of copying was sacred. He wrote about how the world below had moved forward without the monastery, how technology had soared and transformed, how humans had learned to fly and to speak across impossible distances and to capture light itself. He wrote about how all of this progress had been purchased with a kind of forgetting, and then he began to write about silence. He wrote about the beauty of silence, the way it could be as present as sound. He wrote about how a monastery, despite its bells and chants, was fundamentally a place devoted to silence, to the listening silence that comes when you stop trying to fill the world with noise. He wrote about the monks who had come to this place seeking escape from the chaos of the secular world. He wrote about what had drawn them, the promise that here, in this sheltered space, they could transcribe truth without interruption, without the pressure to produce anything useful, anything that would sell or seduce or dominate. They could write for the love of writing, and in that simple act, they could touch something eternal. The candles in the Scriptorium were burning lower and lower. Erasmus had not left the room in days. He took meals at his desk, hunched over the growing manuscript. He slept in brief snatches, his head on the parchment, and woke with fresh urgency, ready to continue. His eyes felt strange, sometimes too sharp, sometimes too dim. His hands had developed their own rhythm, independent of his conscious will. The pen seemed to move without requiring thought. He wrote the story of the last monastery in a country that had forgotten monasticism existed. He wrote about 5 monks remaining, and then 4, and then 3. He wrote about the buildings growing cold. He wrote about how silence began to echo differently when there was no one to break it. He wrote about Brother Theodorus keeping faith in a world that had stopped believing. He wrote about Erasmus's own childhood, details he hadn't thought about in years, the smell of his father's study, the way light fell through a particular window, the moment he understood that he was being sent away. He wrote it all without judgment, with a kind of merciful acceptance, as though by transcribing these memories, he was giving them a place to rest. The morning came when Erasmus realized he was writing his own death. He was describing a monk at a desk, not by name, but in such precise detail that it could only be him, and the monk was approaching the end. There was no melodrama in the description, no grand finale. The monk simply finished his work, his hands stilled, his eyes closed. The pen fell from his fingers one final time. Erasmus stopped writing. He read the words he had just set down, and he understood what they meant. The manuscript was complete. The final account had been written. Everything that needed to be said had been said. He reached for his pen one last time. In the silence of the scriptorium, surrounded by the fruits of his labor pages and pages of perfect script, he wrote a single final sentence. The words came slowly, deliberately, with the weight of completion behind them. Here ends the account of all things. The moment his pen lifted from the page, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flash of light, no thunder from heaven. But Erasmus felt it nonetheless. A kind of settling, as though the entire world had taken a deep breath and held it. He looked around the scriptorium, at the candles still burning steadily on their stands, at the manuscripts stacked on shelves, at the empty desks where other monks had once worked. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet everything had changed. He tried to write another word, just to see if he could, but his hand wouldn't obey. The pen simply hung in the air above the parchment, unresponsive. He tried again. Nothing. It was as though the ability to write had been a guest who had finally decided to leave. Erasmus set the pen down carefully on the desk. He didn't feel afraid. Instead, he felt something like peace, which was stranger and deeper than he would have expected. The bells rang, all 7 of them, in a sequence Erasmus had never heard before. A summons. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from days of sitting, and walked out of the scriptorium into the corridor. The monastery was different. The walls seemed younger, somehow, and the light coming through the windows had a quality Erasmus couldn't quite place. He walked toward the chapel, and found all the remaining monks gathered there. They were standing, not sitting, and they were facing a wall, the western wall, where there had never been a window before. But there was a window there now. It was tall and narrow, and through it, Erasmus could see something he had never expected to see again, the world beyond the monastery. He could see trees and fields and distant mountains catching the last light of evening. He could see roads, and at the edges of his vision, he thought he could see cities, though they were so far away that they might have been merely suggestions. "What is happening?" he asked. One of the monks, Brother Matthias, who had been at the monastery almost as long as Erasmus, turned to face him. His face was peaceful, but there was something like finality in his expression. "We are being released," he said simply. "The task is complete. The final account has been written. There is nothing more to preserve here. But the manuscripts," Erasmus began, "are no longer ours to keep," another voice said. Erasmus turned and saw that it was the voice of Brother Theodorus, though the abbot was no longer there. The words seemed to come from the air itself, or from the walls, or from some deeper place. "They will be found, they will be read, they will be lost again and found anew. That is the nature of writing. But our work is finished. Our vigil is complete." The monks began to move toward the window. One by one, they approached it, looked out at the world beyond, and stepped through. There was no dramatic transformation, no flash of light or sound. They simply walked into the world, and they were gone. Erasmus found himself alone in the chapel, facing the window. He stood there for a long time, not moving. Behind him, he could feel the presence of the scriptorium, of all those pages he had filled, of all those words that would outlast him. He thought about what it meant to write the last thing, to know that after you, there would be silence. He approached the window. Before stepping through, he turned and looked back at the monastery interior. It was exactly as it had been, stone and candles and shadows. It was exactly as it should be. He thought of Brother Theodorus, who had carried the burden of ending for so long. He thought of all the scribes who had come before, each one adding their thread to the great tapestry. He thought of future readers, people not yet born, who would someday discover his manuscript and try to understand what it meant. And then Erasmus stepped through the window. The world was strange. It had been so many years since he had felt wind on his face, since he had heard so many sounds at once. Traffic, he realized automobiles moving on distant roads. Birds calling in patterns he had never heard before. The air was different, cleaner or dirtier. He couldn't quite tell. The light was softer than he remembered, filtered through something pollution, maybe, or simply the passage of time. He stood at the edge of a field of tall grass that seemed to go on forever. Behind him, the monastery had already begun to fade, not disappearing, but becoming less real, as though it were shifting to a different plane of existence. He could see it clearly, and yet he also understood that it was no longer in the same world as him. Erasmus began to walk. His legs remembered how to do it, though they were uncertain. He walked through the field as the sun descended, and as it descended, he realized something. He could no longer write. The ability had left him completely, not like a gradual forgetting, but like a door slamming shut. He tried to form the letters in his mind, tried to compose a sentence, and found that he couldn't. The impulse simply wasn't there. It should have terrified him. Instead, it was liberating. 53 years he had spent with words, and now he was free from them. He opened his mouth and spoke aloud something he had barely done in decades, and his voice came out rough but clear. "I am here," he said to the empty field. "I have come to see what exists beyond the last word." The field stretched on. In the distance, Erasmus could see lights, the lights of a city, perhaps, or a town. He began walking toward them, away from the fading monastery, away from the scriptorium with all its precious manuscripts, away from the life he had lived in ink and parchment. Behind him, the monastery disappeared entirely. He didn't turn to look. Some thresholds, once crossed, should not be retraced. Days later, Erasmus found himself in a small library in a small town in a country he didn't recognize. He didn't remember arriving there. There was a gap in his recollection, as though he had spent several days in a state of waking sleep. But the library was real, and he was real, and he walked among the shelves with wonder. There were books everywhere, thousands of them, tens of thousands. Each one contained words, millions upon millions of words, all of them written, all of them preserved. Erasmus walked along the shelves in a kind of trance, reading titles, running his fingers along spines. He recognized some of the names of authors, people who had written centuries ago, people who had written recently, people whose works had survived against impossible odds. He found himself drawn to a particular section, history and archives. Here were records of monasteries. Here were accounts of the medieval period. Here were scholarly treatments of medieval scribes, reproductions of their manuscripts, discussions of their methods and their purpose. Erasmus pulled a book at random from the shelf and opened it. Inside was a facsimile of a manuscript page, not from his monastery, but from another one, another scriptorium in another place and time. The script was similar to his own, that careful, meditative script that all monks learned. And as he looked at it, Erasmus understood something that he had never quite understood before. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the last scribe, or even the last monk. There were thousands of them, across centuries, in places he had never been, all doing the same work, all copying words to preserve them, all devotedly transcribing meaning into form. The work hadn't ended with him. It had simply transformed. Some of these monks had seen the printing press arrive and had adapted to it. Some had continued copying by hand even after technology made it unnecessary, because the work itself was sacred, not the product. The impulse to transcribe, to preserve, to say, "I was here, and I mattered," and I left something behind, that impulse was older than monasteries, older than writing itself. It was baked into human nature. Erasmus spent the night in the library. It wasn't open at night, but he had hidden himself in a back room, and no one had found him. He emerged in the morning, slightly stiff, but suffused with something like contentment. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes, looked startled to see him step out from behind the reference desk, but she didn't ask questions. Perhaps she assumed he was staff, or perhaps she simply saw something in his face that made her understand. This man needed to be here. Days became weeks. Erasmus found work as a cleaner in the library, and in exchange, he was allowed to sleep in a small room in the basement and to spend his days among the books. He had no money, no identification, no connections to the world, but he needed none of these things. What he had was the library, and that was everything. He developed a routine. He would spend his mornings cleaning, sweeping dust from the shelves, organizing books that had been left in disorder. In his afternoons, he would read. He read voraciously, consuming histories and novels, poetry and science. He read about the world that had changed in the years he had spent in the monastery. He read about wars and peace, technological revolutions, the rise and fall of empires. He read about the digital revolution, about how writing had migrated to screens, about how the future had already arrived, and he had somehow managed to skip over it entirely. And he read the works of monks. He searched out medieval manuscripts, illuminated books, the works that scribes had spent their entire lives transcribing. He found a book called The Life of the Scribe that contained interviews with monks who were still alive, still copying manuscripts by hand in the 21st century. He read about monasteries in Ireland and Germany and France that had maintained their scriptoriums even after the invention of the printing press. He read about the modern calligraphers who had taken up the work, who had chosen, in an age of computers, to preserve the ancient art of handwriting. And slowly, Erasmus began to understand what the abbot had meant. The ending he had written wasn't the ending of writing. It was the ending of a particular form of writing, a particular era, a particular way of being in the world. But writing itself, the impulse to transcribe meaning, would never end. It would transform, migrate, find new homes in new technologies, but it would endure. He thought often of the manuscript he had completed. Where was it now? Had it been found? Was it in some archive, or had it simply vanished, its pages scattering like leaves? The not knowing was strangely peaceful. The work itself was the point. He had written it, he had finished it, and now it belonged to time. One day, a researcher came into the library. She was a young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, and she had come searching for something specific. Erasmus watched her move through the stacks with purpose, consulting catalog cards, pulling volumes with careful reverence. Eventually, she came to the history section, where Erasmus was reorganizing books that had been left in disarray. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for any resources on medieval monasteries in Eastern Europe. Specifically, ones that might have had scriptoriums or collections that went missing during the 20th century. Erasmus felt something shift inside his chest. "I might be able to help you," he said. They talked for hours. The woman, her name was Elena, was researching a mysterious manuscript that had surfaced at an auction in Switzerland. It was exceptionally old, written in a script that belonged to the late medieval period, but the content was impossible. It contained information that shouldn't have existed, historical details that weren't recorded anywhere else, stories and accounts that seemed to have been written from inside the events themselves. The manuscript was vast hundreds of pages, and it culminated in the account of a monastery that had somehow stepped outside of time. "The strangest part," Elena said, "is that it ends very abruptly. Just as the narrative is approaching a climactic moment, it stops. The last sentence is, 'Here ends the account of all things.' And then nothing. No conclusion, no final reflection. It's like the writer simply walked away in the middle of the story. Erasmus felt his hands trembling. "Do you have the manuscript with you?" he asked. Elena looked at him curiously. "I have photographs, high-resolution scans." "Why?" She showed him the images on her laptop, and there, unmistakably, was his own handwriting, his own words. The manuscript he had spent those endless days completing. And she was right. It ended suddenly, mysteriously, as though the writer had suddenly ceased to exist. Where did it come from? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "That's the mystery," Elena said. "It appeared at an auction house in Zurich about 5 years ago. The provenance is completely unclear. There's speculation that it might have come from an old estate, or possibly from some private collection that was being liquidated. But no one knows for certain. The monastery described in it, we haven't been able to locate it. We've searched every record of medieval monasteries in Eastern Europe, and there's no match. It's like the place existed outside of history." Erasmus stood in the library, surrounded by books and light, looking at his own words displayed on a luminescent screen, and he began to laugh. Not from humor, but from a kind of overwhelming amazement at the strangeness of existence. He had spent his entire life devoted to preserving words. He had believed his task was to ensure that meaning survived, that knowledge would be passed forward to those who came after. And then he had written one final account and stepped out of the world, and the manuscript had floated through time and space until it had ended up in the hands of a researcher who was trying to understand what it meant. This was what all writers eventually discovered, he realized. You put your words out into the world, and then you had no control over where they went, what they meant, how they would be interpreted. The work belonged to those who found it, not to those who created it. The meaning multiplied and transformed with each new reader. This was the strange immortality of writing. Not that it preserved exactly what you intended, but that it preserved your intention itself, your desire to speak, your refusal to be silent. "Do you know what this is?" Elena was asking him. "Do you know anything about it? You seem like you have some connection to this manuscript." Erasmus looked at the young woman. She had dedicated her life to trying to understand something that had emerged from a monastery outside of time. She had traveled the world searching for answers. She had become, in her own way, a kind of modern scribe, a custodian of knowledge, a preserver of meaning, a witness to stories that might otherwise be lost. "I know exactly what it is," Erasmus said. "It's a prayer, the longest prayer ever written. It's someone saying, 'I was here. I mattered. I lived. And I left this behind.'" Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You can tell me if you know who wrote it," she said gently. "It won't seem crazy. I work with medieval manuscripts. Nothing seems crazy to me anymore." And so Erasmus sat down and he told her the truth. He told her about the monastery, about Brother Theodorus and his burden, about the manuscript that seemed to grow and transform under his pen. He told her about reaching the ending and stepping through the window into a world that had moved on without him. He told her about finding his way to this library, this place of preserved words and collected meaning. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I believe you," she finally said. "Not because what you're describing is logical, but because it's the only explanation that makes sense. The manuscript is impossible by every conventional measure. The writing style is consistent throughout, but the content spans centuries. It's as though someone did exactly what you described. They wrote everything, all of it, compressed into a single account. And then they stopped, finished, like they had said everything that needed saying." "Yes," Erasmus said. "That's exactly what I did. Can I ask you something?" Elena leaned forward. "After you finished, after you wrote that final sentence, do you regret it? Do you wish you could write again?" Erasmus thought about this carefully. He thought about his hands, which had been so bound up in the act of writing for so long, and which now were free to do other things. He thought about the world he had stepped into, which moved so much faster than the world of the Scriptorium. He thought about how words surrounded him, constantly now printed on signs and screens, spoken in conversations, transmitted invisibly through the air in networks he barely understood. "No," he said, "I don't regret it, because the silence that came after wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of other people's words, other people's voices, other people's attempts to transcribe meaning. My silence made space for them." And isn't that what we all trying to do to make space for those who come after? Elena's research eventually resulted in a book. It was published 3 years later, and it became something of a sensation in academic circles. The story of a mysterious medieval manuscript that had resurfaced centuries after it was written. A detailed account of what it contained and the peculiar testimony of the man who claimed to be its author. Most scholars dismissed it as an elaborate fiction, a deliberate hoax. But some, a growing number, began to entertain the possibility that the manuscript was something else entirely. Not a hoax, but a miracle. A genuine account of something that existed outside the normal parameters of time and history. Erasmus didn't care whether people believed. The book had brought Elena success, had gotten her a position as a professor at a prestigious university, had ensured that the manuscript now housed in a climate-controlled archive would be preserved and studied for generations to come. That was enough. He had faded back into obscurity. He still worked at the library, still spent his days among the books. He was older, now not just because years had passed, but because something fundamental in him had aged. He had stepped outside of time once, and he had come back into it, and the crossing had left marks. But he was at peace. He would sometimes see readers bent over manuscripts in the library, and he would watch them with a kind of wonder. Each one was a scribe in their own way, transcribing the world into their own understanding, marking pages with notes and observations, creating their own accounts of all things. And when he saw a young person pick up a fountain pen and write something by hand, something that could have been typed or texted or otherwise mediated by technology, but had been chosen to be written in actual ink on actual paper, Erasmus would smile. The work continued. Different forms, different tools, but the same impulse. The same human desire to preserve meaning, to say, "I was here, I thought this, I believe this, and I'm leaving it for you." One evening, as Erasmus was closing the library for the night, Elena appeared at the door. She had come back to the town. It was a habit of hers, now that the manuscript had become central to her work. She liked to visit the place where she had first encountered it. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "The manuscript is being translated. Multiple translations into German, French, Spanish, Polish, and they're finding new things in it. Codes, patterns, meanings that seem to shift depending on how you read it. It's like it's a living text, constantly revealing new depths." "That's as it should be," Erasmus said. "A true book is never finished. Readers complete it, and each reader completes it differently." "I also wanted to tell you that I'm starting my own translation," Elena said, "directly from the original medieval script into modern language. It's a massive undertaking. I'm not sure I'll finish it before I die, but I wanted to do it anyway. I wanted to be a scribe too, to have my hands touch the same words that your hands touched, and to translate them forward into a language that my contemporaries can understand." Erasmus felt tears forming in his eyes. He understood what she was offering, a continuation, a way of keeping the work alive, not by simply preserving the manuscript in a museum, but by engaging with it, by adding our own voice and interpretation to it, becoming part of the chain of transcription that stretched from him backward through countless scribes and forward into an unknown future. "Then the work never ends," he said. "No," Elena agreed. "I don't think it ever does. I think the abbot understood that. I think you understood it too, by the end. The silence isn't an ending. It's a transition. The silence between one voice and the next. They stood together in the library as the evening light faded. Outside, the world moved on with its endless noise and activity. But here in this room filled with books, there was a kind of peace, not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of all possible sounds compressed into written form, waiting to be released by readers who might come 1,000 years hence. "Thank you for finishing the manuscript," Elena said. "Thank you for writing it all down, for preserving what needed to be preserved, and then for having the courage to stop." Erasmus nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. They both understood, in the way that people who have touched the sacred do understand, that something extraordinary had occurred. Not just the manuscript itself, but the entire arc of it, the dedication, the completion, the stepping away, the re-emergence, the continuation. It was a perfect cycle, and it would continue long after both of them were gone. Years passed. Erasmus grew older still. His hair turned entirely white, and his frame became even more gaunt. But his mind remained sharp, and his peace remained absolute. He had discovered something that few people ever find, the knowledge that his work was complete, that he had nothing left to prove, that whatever time remained to him was simply a gift unexpected, unearned, received with gratitude. The library became a kind of shrine to him, though this happened without any conscious intention on his part. Readers would come searching for him, wanting to meet the man who had written the impossible manuscript. He would speak with them if they seemed sincere, would share portions of his story, would listen to their own accounts of why the manuscript had mattered to them. Some had found comfort in its pages. Some had discovered answers to questions they'd been carrying for years. Some simply wanted to know if what they'd read could possibly be real. He always told them the same thing. The truth of a story isn't measured by whether it happened in the world as you know it. The truth of a story is measured by whether it illuminates something real about human experience. And if it does that, then it's true in the way that matters most. Elena became a frequent visitor to the library. Her translation project consumed her for the better part of a decade. She would work in a small room at the library, surrounded by facsimiles of the original manuscript, consulting with Erasmus whenever she encountered passages that were particularly cryptic or dense. Together, they would unpack the meanings, excavate the layers, try to divine what the monk's intention had been in each particular section. "This part," Elena said one afternoon, pointing to a passage roughly in the middle of the manuscript, "it seems to describe the abbot dying, but it's written in second person, as though you're addressing him directly. You are going to die soon. The burden I have carried is about to pass from this world. Why switch perspectives here? Why address him directly when everywhere else you're describing events?" Erasmus leaned back in his chair and thought about this. "I think," he said slowly, "I was writing a prayer without calling it a prayer. I couldn't write about Theodorus's death from a distance, as though I were simply documenting it. I had to speak to him directly. I had to say goodbye." "So the entire manuscript is a kind of goodbye?" Elena asked. "Yes," Erasmus said, "to everyone, to everything, but also a hello. A final hello to everyone who had come after and read these words. A way of saying, I saw you. I knew you were coming. I left this for you." Elena incorporated this insight into her translation. The result was a text that read, paradoxically, both like a historical document and like a personal letter. Readers reported feeling directly addressed by the manuscript, as though Erasmus had been writing to them specifically, even though the manuscript predated them by centuries. The translation was published to considerable acclaim. It won prizes, was taught in universities, was referenced in theological and philosophical papers. Scholars began to develop interpretations of the manuscript that Erasmus himself had never considered. Some read it as an allegory for the death of organized religion. Others saw it as a meditation on the digital revolution and the end of the printed page. Still others treated it as a work of mysticism, a genuine spiritual document that had somehow been channeled through the hands of a medieval monk. All of these interpretations, Erasmus felt, contained elements of truth. This was the miracle of language. It could mean many things simultaneously, and all of them could be right. The library began to deteriorate. It was a very old building, and the town it sat in had slowly been dying for decades. Businesses closed, young people moved away. The infrastructure of everyday life became increasingly fragile. The library itself fell into disrepair. The roof began to leak. The walls developed cracks. The municipality, faced with budget constraints, talked about closing it. Elena fought hard to save it. She organized fundraisers, gave lectures highlighting the library's historical significance, wrote grant proposals to preservation societies. She was partially successful enough funding came through to stabilize the building and prevent immediate closure. But the library's future remained uncertain. Erasmus watched all of this without particular alarm. He had already died once, in a manner of speaking, when he stepped through the window of the monastery. Everything that came after was grace. The library would close, or it would survive. Either way, the work would continue. Books couldn't be destroyed as long as people cared about them. They could be lost, damaged, scattered to the winds, but they couldn't be truly destroyed. One evening, the director of the library, a man in his 50s named Marcus, came to find Erasmus. He was holding a box of old documents. "I found these in the basement," Marcus said. They seemed to be personal papers, letters, notes. They were in a box labeled with your name. "I'm not sure how they got here, or how long they've been down there, but I thought you should have them." Erasmus took the box with some trepidation. He hadn't written anything in decades, hadn't been intentional about creating records or documents. But when he opened it and looked inside, he found something remarkable: copies of everything. The manuscript pages, not originals, but careful transcriptions in Elena's handwriting. Letters from readers who had been moved by the manuscript. Clippings from newspapers and journals documenting the discovery and subsequent fame of the work. Photographs of the monastery, taken by archaeologists who had eventually located it. It still stood, abandoned, somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains. Sketches and diagrams attempting to map the monastery's layout. Academic papers analyzing the text. It was a complete record of the manuscript's journey from his hands into the world. Someone Elena, he suspected, though she never confirmed it, had been keeping track, preserving the documentation of preservation itself. At the bottom of the box, he found a letter addressed to him. It was in Elena's handwriting, but the words were not what he expected. They were the words of Brother Theodorus, copied out by Elena from memory, from something Erasmus had told her years ago. The work never ends. It simply takes new forms. You are not the last scribe. You are one scribe among countless scribes, stretching backward and forward through time. Your job was to write the ending. Yes, but endings are always also beginnings. The moment the period is placed, someone else picks up the pen. Erasmus read this and understood. Elena hadn't just been studying his manuscript. She had been continuing the work in her own way. She had been a scribe, taking his words and adding her own annotations, her own interpretations, preserving not just the text, but the entire context of meaning-making that surrounded it. He began, slowly, to document things himself. Not stories or grand narratives, but simple observations. Notes about daily life in the library. Records of conversations with readers. Descriptions of how light fell through the windows at different times of day. Reflections on books he had read. Meditations on what it meant to live in a space devoted to preserved knowledge. He wrote these things out by hand, in a careful script that was less perfect than it had once been, but no less intentional. He wasn't writing to be published. He wasn't writing for an audience. He was simply writing the way he had always written, because the act of writing itself was the point. Because transcribing the world into language, no matter how flawed or personal that transcription might be, was a way of saying, this mattered. I was here, and I paid attention, and I left a record. A young person came to work at the library. Her name was Sophia, and she was 17. She had come through the library's youth volunteer program and had been assigned to help with basic tasks, shelving books, organizing materials, assisting patrons. She was quiet and observant, and she spent much of her time simply watching how the library worked, how people moved through it, what they chose to read. One day, Sophia asked Erasmus if she could watch him work. He was sitting at a small desk in a corner, hand-copying passages from books into a journal. It was a strange occupation, and Sophia wanted to understand why he did it. I read a book, she said, and I don't want to forget it. I want to hold on to the words, so I copy them out. But nobody really does that anymore. People highlight them on their phones or take pictures. Why do you still write by hand? Erasmus considered this. Because the act of copying forces you to slow down, he finally said. When you type or photograph words, your eyes move faster than your mind can actually process them. But when you write by hand, you're forced to engage with each word individually. You have to make choices about every letter. You can feel the words entering your body through your hand, becoming part of you in a different way than if you simply read them. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Can you teach me?" And so began a strange apprenticeship. Sophia would come to the library after school, and Erasmus would show her how to hold a pen, how to form letters, how to balance speed with legibility, how to find the meditative rhythm that came from extended copying work. He gave her passages to transcribe, some from famous works, some from obscure books that only existed in that one library, some that he had written himself. Sophia turned out to have genuine talent. Her handwriting was beautiful, flowing, individual. She brought an attention to the work that suggested she understood something fundamental about it. She wasn't just transcribing. She was in conversation with the texts she was copying. She would mark passages that surprised her, would add small comments in the margins, would sometimes pause to sit with a particularly dense section of meaning before continuing. "I'm using my phone less," she told Erasmus one afternoon. "Ever since we started this, I think faster when I write. I remember better." "That's because you're remembering with your whole body," Erasmus said, "not just your mind." Sophia began bringing books to the library, specifically to copy from them. She started a journal of her own, not like Erasmus's practical documentation, but something more like a confession. She would write about her day, her worries, her hopes for a future that seemed impossible in the world as it was. And as she wrote, something shifted in her. The act of handwriting her thoughts seemed to give them more weight, more reality, more possibility. One evening, as the library was closing, Sophia asked Erasmus the question that had clearly been building in her for weeks. "Is what they say about you true? Did you really write a manuscript that exists outside of time?" Erasmus didn't hesitate. He had been asked this question many times, and he had learned that the truthful answer was always yes, but not for the reasons people expected. "I wrote a manuscript," he said, "and then I stepped into another world. And somehow the manuscript found its way back to this world, where it has lived a life of its own. Whether that life exists outside of time depends on how you define time. But yes, I wrote something true that couldn't possibly be true according to normal rules. And I believe you can too." "I want to," Sophia said. "I want to write something that matters, something that will last." "Then keep writing," Erasmus said. "Don't worry about whether it will last. Just write with intention. Write as though what you're saying is sacred. Write as though someone, someday, will find these pages and will need to read them. That's all any of us can do." Elena came to the library one final time when she was 83 years old. She was frail now, moving slowly, but her eyes were still bright with intelligence and curiosity. She carried with her a bound volume, the final version of her translation, in its complete and published form. It was beautiful, leather-bound, printed on high-quality paper, with her introduction and extensive notes. "I've finished," she told Erasmus. "It took me 30 years, but I've finished the translation. And I've done something else. I've transcribed it all by hand as well. 2 copies, one for each of us. I wanted you to have something in your own language, written in my hand, to pass on to whoever comes after." She showed him the manuscript. It was enormous, hundreds of pages, all in Elena's increasingly shaky but still beautiful handwriting. The act of transcribing it all by hand must have taken her years. "Why did you do this?" Erasmus asked. "Because I'm a scribe too," Elena said simply. "I spent so much time studying the manuscript that I became part of its tradition. I wanted to contribute something physical, something that came from my hands. I wanted to continue the chain." They spent that day together in the library, going through both versions of the translation side by side. Elena showed him places where she had made difficult decisions about word choice, places where the medieval language had no direct equivalent in modern speech. She showed him passages that had moved her while translating them, words that had revealed new meanings through the act of transcription. "There's something I want to tell you," Elena said toward the end of the day. "Something about how the translation ends." "How does it end?" Erasmus asked. "It doesn't," Elena said. "Or rather, it ends where your manuscript ends, with 'here ends the account of all things.' But I've added something after that, a translator's note. I've written about this whole process, about meeting you, about spending decades trying to understand what you had written. And I've left a space at the end, space for the next person to add their own account. I've signed my name and left instructions for whoever inherits the manuscript next. I want it to continue growing. I want each translator, each reader, each scribe who touches it to add their own voice." Erasmus understood the elegance of this solution. By leaving space, Elena had transformed the manuscript from a finished work into something living and evolving. The ending was no longer an ending. It was a pause, a moment between one voice and the next. "I love you," he said to Elena. He had never said this before, though he had thought it many times. "Thank you for continuing the work." Elena reached out and took his hand. They sat like that for a long time, 2 scribes in a library surrounded by the accumulated preservation of countless other scribes, and they didn't need to speak. The words had all been said, and the silence between them was full and complete. Sophia came to the library the day after Elena's final visit. She arrived at her usual time after school, but something was different. She walked up to Erasmus with a small notebook in her hands. "I've finished something," she said. "I know I'm young, and I've only been doing this for a few months, but I wanted to show you anyway." She opened the notebook. It was filled with her handwriting, not copied passages, but her own words, stories and observations, poetry and sketches, maps of her interior landscape, in the way that all authentic writing is a map of how a person thinks and sees. "It's not finished," Sophia said nervously. Erasmus took the notebook and began to read. What he found was remarkable. A voice that was uniquely Sophia's, that spoke from the specific moment of adolescence, when everything is still possible and everything is still terrifying. She wrote about school and friendship, about her family's struggles, about her dreams for what she might become. But she also wrote about silence and books, and the strange peace that came from handwriting words. "It matters," Erasmus said when he had finished reading. "This is real. You have a voice, and it's worth preserving." "Do you think people will ever read it?" Sophia asked. "I don't know," Erasmus said, "but I know that it will exist. I know that you created something that didn't exist before. And that's what matters. The rest, whether it's read, whether it's remembered, whether it survives, that's beyond your control. But the creation itself is entirely in your hands. Sophia began coming to the library not just to volunteer, but to write. She would sit in that corner with Erasmus, and they would work in companionable silence, him transcribing passages that called to him, her writing her own original words. Sometimes they would share what they were working on. Sometimes they would simply exist in the same space, in the knowledge that they were both engaged in the ancient and sacred work of turning thought into written form. Erasmus died on a Tuesday morning in early spring. He was 91 years old. He had been sitting at his desk in the library, his journal open in front of him, and he had simply stopped breathing. The director found him there an hour later, looking peaceful, one hand still resting on the page, as though he had been in the middle of a sentence when the world decided to let him go. They found his journal open to the last entry. It was only a few lines. The work continues. The silence is not an ending. The silence is a space where new voices can emerge. I have lived longer than I had any right to live, and I have seen the manuscript transform into something far greater than I ever imagined. It has been an honor to serve. It has been enough. Sophia read this entry and wept, not from grief, but from gratitude. Erasmus had given her permission, she understood, to continue, to pick up the pen and add her own voice to the endless chain of scribes that stretched across time. In his will, a simple document he had written and had witnessed by the library director, Erasmus left everything to Sophia. His journals, his notes, his copy of Elena's handwritten translation. Everything that had belonged to the old scribe passed into the hands of the young one. 20 years later, Sophia published a book. It was a collection of her own writing, the notebooks from her teenage years, her observations as a young adult, her reflections on the manuscript, and Erasmus's legacy. The book became unexpectedly popular. Readers responded to Sophia's voice, to the clarity and honesty with which she had documented her own internal journey. With the money from the book, Sophia was able to purchase the library building when it went into foreclosure. She renovated it, preserved it, and created a kind of museum and workspace devoted to the tradition of handwriting and manuscript making. She called it the Scriptorium. Young people came there to learn calligraphy, to copy texts by hand, to engage with the ancient arts of preservation and transcription. But the centerpiece of the Scriptorium was a glass case in the main room, and in that case was the manuscript, the original manuscript that Erasmus had written in the monastery outside of time. Visitors could see it, but not touch it. They could read Elena's translation displayed beside it. And there was a book recording everything. Erasmus's story, Alana's research, Sophia's reflections, and the accounts of dozens of other people who had encountered the manuscript and had been changed by it. And there was space at the back of that book. Space for the next person, whoever they might be, to add their own testimony, their own understanding of what the manuscript meant. One evening, as Sophia was closing the Scriptorium, a person came in. She was old, perhaps in her 70s, and she was carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth. "I believe this belongs here," the woman said, and she unwrapped the cloth to reveal a manuscript. It was written in handwriting that Sophia recognized. It was Erasmus's, the same hand that had written all those journals she had inherited. "What is this?" Sophia asked. "It's something Erasmus gave me," the woman said. "I was a student at the library when I was young. I came there to read, and Erasmus would talk to me about books and writing. One day, he gave me this journal and told me to fill it with my own thoughts. He told me to copy passages from books I loved and to write my own words as well. He told me that the act of writing was sacred and that I had something to say that the world needed to hear. I carried this journal with me for 50 years. I filled it completely. And then I started another one and another. And all these years I thought, this is just for me. This is my private record. But now I'm old, and I won't be writing much longer, and I thought, perhaps this should live in this place. Perhaps my voice should be part of this collection." Sophia looked at the journal. It was filled with beautiful handwriting, not perfect, but alive and present. There were passages copied from 100 different books, and alongside them, the woman's own reflections and observations and stories. "Yes," Sophia said. "Yes, this belongs here. Thank you for bringing it." The woman stayed for 2 hours. She and Sophia sat together and looked through the journal, and the woman told the stories behind some of the passages, explained why certain books had mattered to her, described how the act of handwriting had shaped her life. And when she left something behind. Her voice, her presence, her testimony that the work mattered, that the chain of scribes continued unbroken. Sophia placed the journal in a special place in the Scriptorium, and she understood, in that moment, what Erasmus had always known, that every act of preservation was an act of love, and every scribe was adding their thread to an infinite tapestry, and that the work would never be finished, because the work itself was the point, not the completion. Years passed. The Scriptorium became a pilgrimage site for people who believed in the power of handwritten words. They came to learn, to preserve, to add their own voices to the collection. Some came to copy sections of the original manuscript by hand. Some came to transcribe texts that were about to be lost to time. Some came simply to sit in the presence of ancient, carefully preserved words, to feel the weight of human intention that lived in every handwritten line. Sophia grew old herself. She trained others to maintain the collection, to treat the manuscripts with reverence, to understand that they were holding not just paper and ink, but the actual presence of human minds and hearts that had been captured and preserved. One of her students was a young person named Marcus, named after the old library director who had first shown Erasmus the box of documents. Marcus had the same reverence for the work that Sophia had, the same understanding that this was sacred. Why does it matter? Marcus asked her one day, in a world where everything is digitized, where we can store infinite data in the cloud, why does it matter that we hand copy manuscripts and preserve them in this building? Sophia thought about this carefully. Because, she said, there is something that happens when you write something by hand that doesn't happen when you type it. When your hand forms each letter, when you have to make decisions about spacing and pressure, when your body is involved in the act of writing something transfers. A kind of presence. The people who come here and read these handwritten manuscripts, they can feel that presence. They can feel the writer behind the words. And that feeling, that connection across time, that's what reminds us we're human. That's what keeps us sane in a world that's increasingly abstract and disembodied. Marcus nodded, and he seemed to understand. The next day, he began transcribing a text by hand, a book that had never been hand-copied before. It would take him months, but he did it with intention, with the knowledge that he was joining a chain of scribes that stretched from the medieval period to the present moment and beyond into a future he would never see. The manuscript, the original, the one that Erasmus had written in the monastery, was 1,217 pages long. Nobody had ever counted them before. Sophia did so in her final years, wanting to leave an accurate record. Each page was perfect, or as close to perfect as human hands could make them. And at the end of the final page, in smaller script than the rest, was a note that nobody had noticed before, or perhaps it had appeared only after time had worked upon it, revealing what had always been there. To whoever reads this, know that you are part of a lineage. You are a scribe, whether you have written words by hand or simply chosen to preserve and honor words that others have written. You are part of an unbroken chain that stretches back to the beginning of written language and forward into a future you will never see. Your task is not to create the greatest work ever written. Your task is simply to show up, to pay attention, to transcribe meaning into form, and to pass it forward. The work is never finished. The silence is not an ending. It is a pause between one voice and the next. Do not be afraid of the silence. It is full. After this, there was one blank page, and then another, and another, dozens of them, all blank, all waiting. Erasmus had left them there. Sophia understood, not as an error, but as an intentional gift. Space for others to add their voices, to continue the manuscript into the future, to transform what had been a completed work into something living and evolving. The first person to write in one of those blank pages was Sophia. She added a single sentence, in handwriting that had grown shakier with age, but no less intentional. The work continues. I am honored to be part of this chain. I pass it forward. And she left the remaining pages blank for others to fill. On the day that Sophia died, the Scriptorium was filled with people, young scribes and old readers, preservationists and book lovers, people who had come from across the world to be part of this strange lineage. They came together and held a vigil. They read passages from the manuscript aloud. They shared stories about how the work had changed their lives. They sang not religious songs, but human songs, songs about longing and memory and the desire to be remembered. And then, one by one, they approached the manuscript. Dozens of them wrote in the blank pages that Erasmus had left. They wrote their names, their professions, their reasons for caring about preservation. They wrote their own testimony. They wrote, I am here. I matter. I was part of this chain. By the end of the night, most of the blank pages were filled, but a few remained. And they would remain for the next scribe, the next person who felt called to add their voice. The story of the monastery, of Erasmus and his manuscript, of the chain of scribes that followed him, became legend. Some people treated it as historical fact. There were indeed pilgrimages to the location in the Carpathians where the monastery had supposedly stood, though most scholars argued that the location was impossible, that it existed outside of normal geography. Others treated it as pure fiction, a beautiful story about the power of writing. Still others saw it as something beyond the binary of fact and fiction, a spiritual truth encoded in narrative form. But regardless of how people interpreted it, the effect was the same. More people took up pens. More people chose to handwrite when they could have typed. More people created scriptoriums and preservation centers in their own towns and cities. More people embraced the ancient practice of transcription, the act of copying texts by hand as a form of prayer and meditation. The world had changed dramatically since Erasmus's time. Technology had advanced beyond anything anyone in the monastery could have imagined. Most written words now existed only as digital data, ephemeral and easily deleted. But precisely because of this, the handwritten word had gained new value. It had become radical in its slowness, its permanence, its refusal to be instantly updated or deleted. The Scriptorium became a model. Dozens of other preservation centers were founded, following Sophia's template. In each of these places, the same work continued. Books were hand-copied, manuscripts were transcribed, collections were preserved. Young people came to learn the ancient skills. Old people came to contribute their own voices before they died. And in each of these places, there was a glass case, and in that case was a copy of the original manuscript, or if they didn't have the manuscript itself, at least a high-quality facsimile. Readers could see the handwriting, could encounter the presence of Erasmus's intention, preserved in the form of his script. And they understood, without being told explicitly, that they were part of something ancient and ongoing, something that transcended individual lives and reached backward and forward through time. Centuries later, in a world that had experienced countless technological revolutions, a young person walked into a library. This library was different from the one where Erasmus had worked. It was built with new materials. It used new forms of light. It had design elements that would have been impossible in earlier eras. But in its essence, it was the same, a place devoted to the preservation and sharing of knowledge. The young person was looking for something specific. They had read about the monastery, about Erasmus, about the chain of scribes that had continued his work. They had read the manuscript in its various published forms, and had felt something stir in them, some ancient calling that made them want to pick up a pen and write by hand, to preserve words to be part of the chain. They asked the librarian if there were any handwritten manuscripts in the collection. The librarian smiled, a smile that contained decades of understanding, and took them to a room in the back of the library. Inside that room were hundreds of handwritten journals and manuscripts. Some were ancient, preserved under glass. Others were recent, written within the last few years. "Choose one," the librarian said. "Read it. Then, if you wish, you can add your own." The young person selected a journal at random. They opened it and began to read, encountering the handwriting of a scribe they had never met, but instantly recognized as a kindred spirit. The writer had lived 50 years ago, in a country far away, but they had written about the same yearnings, the same desires to preserve meaning, the same belief that the act of writing was sacred. And as they read, the young person understood. The chain was real. It was not metaphorical or symbolic. It was actual. Every scribe was genuinely connected to every other scribe, across centuries, across continents, across all the boundaries that supposedly separated them. When you picked up a pen and wrote by hand with intention, you were joining something that could never be broken. The young person sat down at a desk, pulled out a blank journal, opened a bottle of ink, and picked up a pen. And they began to write. Not a great work, not anything intended for publication, but simply words, honest words, true words, words that came from deep inside them and needed to be expressed. Around them, the library was quiet. Outside, the world roared with noise and activity and endless digital chatter. But here, in this room devoted to preservation, there was silence. And in that silence, the young person wrote, joining a chain that stretched back to a medieval monastery outside of time, and forward into a future that would eventually receive and honor their words. The pen moved across the page. Letters formed. Sentences emerged. The young person was a scribe. They had always been a scribe. They understood now. They would always be a scribe. And the work would never be finished, would never need to be finished, because the work itself was the entire point. Behind them, in the glass case, the original manuscript waited. It would wait for the next reader, the next scribe, the next person to realize that they too were part of this ancient and ongoing tradition. And it would be waiting for centuries hence, preserved by hands that had not yet been born, honored by voices that had not yet learned to speak. The manuscript was not a static thing. It was living. It was growing. With each new scribe who added their voice, it grew richer, deeper, more true. It became, over time, not the record of one monk's vision, but the collective testimony of countless people across generations, all saying the same thing. I was here. I mattered. I felt the weight of meaning, and I transcribed it. I passed it forward. I was a scribe, and the work continues.